The dawn of May 1660 rose quietly over the Thames, spilling light upon a city that had forgotten how to hope. After years of turmoil, London awoke to the sound of bells that had long been silent, and people emerged from narrow streets to watch banners lift in the morning wind. The air smelled of rain and coal smoke, and beneath the noise of footsteps ran a single thought whispered through the crowds. The king was coming home. England had known war, regicide, and rule by generals. Now, for the first time in 2 decades, it was about to see a crown once more. Charles Stuart's return was hailed as a miracle, though in truth, it was an act of exhaustion. The country had bled itself dry in the name of principle, and by 1660 the nation wanted rest more than victory. The Commonwealth had crumbled after Cromwell's death. His son Richard lacked the will to govern, and Parliament dissolved into chaos. Armies without pay drifted home. Ministers quarreled, and the old longing for monarchy, half nostalgia, half necessity, rose again. When the exiled prince issued his Declaration of Breda, promising pardon and liberty of conscience, the people accepted him not as a savior, but as a return to something familiar. Ships waited in the harbor to bring him back, and on that gray morning of May 29th, the future seemed to breathe again. He was 30 when he stepped ashore, a tall man with dark eyes and the easy poise of one accustomed to courts. Years in exile had taught him discretion. He had wandered through France, Spain, and the Low Countries, surviving on the charity of foreign kings and the cunning of his own mind. He had seen his father executed, his family scattered, his cause nearly forgotten. The memory of that scaffold haunted him like a private ghost. It had taught him a simple truth, that a crown without control was only a gilded chain. The cheers of the crowd sounded to him like both triumph and warning. England wanted joy, and Charles gave it freely. The theaters reopened, taverns filled, and music returned to the city. His court shimmered with laughter and wit. He was called the Merry Monarch, and for a while the name fit. But beneath the laughter ran a quiet unease. The monarchy had been restored, yes, but not the power that once defined it. Parliament held the purse, and with it the real strength of the realm. Each session of the Commons reminded the king that every coin, every ship, and every law required their approval. The people had regained their monarch, but they had also learned to live without one. Charles understood this balance more clearly than anyone. He smiled easily, forgave readily, and spoke little of policy. Behind the charm, however, was calculation. He had no wish to share his father's fate, and no illusions about the loyalty of those who cheered him. He would reign, but he would do so quietly, shaping the world from behind the veil of conversation and correspondence. He knew that open confrontation with Parliament would destroy him. If he was to rule, it would have to be by subtle means. The treasury was nearly empty. Years of civil conflict and Cromwell's costly wars had drained the coffers, and trade alone could not refill them. Parliament voted funds sparingly, attaching conditions to every grant. For the king, it was humiliation disguised as formality. He presided over banquets and ceremonies, while debt gnawed at his authority. Even the maintenance of the navy, the pride of England, depended on parliamentary subsidies. Each refusal, each delay chipped away at his independence. In private, he confided to those closest to him that he must find another source of strength, somewhere beyond the reach of domestic politics. Religion added another layer of tension. The scars of the Reformation were still fresh, and suspicion ran deep between Protestant and Catholic, Anglican and Puritan. Charles outwardly supported the Church of England, but his personal sympathies leaned toward tolerance. He had seen enough blood spilled in the name of faith. Yet tolerance in that age was easily mistaken for treachery. When he issued the Declaration of Indulgence, seeking to ease penalties on Catholics and dissenters, Parliament forced him to withdraw it. The same Parliament that restored his crown now shackled his conscience. England celebrated its monarch, but the merriment masked fragility. Fires still burned beneath the surface, political, religious, and economic. The king's image appeared on coins again, yet his power was more symbol than substance. The true sovereignty lay in negotiation, persuasion, and the manipulation of perception. In that world, secrecy became a form of survival. Charles watched the example of Louis XIV across the Channel. The Sun King, whose authority was unquestioned and whose wealth seemed limitless. He admired and envied the French model, a monarch who needed no parliament, who ruled by will alone. To match such splendor, Charles would need money, allies, and freedom from the grip of the commons. And if these could not be obtained openly, he would have to find them in the shadows. It was in these years that the first threads of secret diplomacy began to weave through his reign. Courtiers whispered, letters traveled under seal, and messages were carried across the channel by trusted envoys. What began as a search for financial stability would soon evolve into a delicate web of alliances and betrayals, agreements made in candlelight, written in cipher, signed by hands that could never admit their promises. To his ministers and the public, Charles appeared a genial, almost indifferent ruler. To those who knew him well, he was a man waiting for his moment. London thrived on gossip. Coffee houses buzzed with speculation, pamphlets mocked ministers, and the printing press gave voice to a new kind of public opinion. For the first time, the English people believed they had the right to question power. It was a dangerous environment for a king who valued secrecy. Yet Charles adapted, allowing debate to flourish, while quietly steering events behind closed doors. He cultivated allies, rewarded loyalty, and let rumors serve as shields for the truth. His charm was his weapon, his patience, his armor. The paradox of Charles II was that he ruled best when he seemed to rule least. He understood that direct command invited resistance, but suggestion could move mountains. Over the next years, that instinct would lead him to an extraordinary gamble, an alliance so secret and so daring that even his closest ministers would not know its full terms. It would involve foreign gold, promises of faith, and the subtle rewriting of England's destiny. It would test the limits of monarchy and the endurance of trust. It would also reveal the double edge of power, the freedom to act unseen, and the cost of living behind the mask. For now, in the summer of 1660, none of that was visible. The city rejoiced, bonfires burned, and bells rang until midnight. The king smiled from his balcony, his dark hair catching the glow of torchlight, and the crowd below shouted his name. To them, he was the return of stability, the restoration of glory. But within him stirred the quiet realization that glory without authority was only illusion. As the cheers faded and the night grew still, Charles turned from the window and murmured words that no one heard. England had its king again. Yet for Charles II, the crown was not the end of struggle, but its beginning. The years ahead would force him to balance faith against survival, honesty against necessity, and the expectations of a nation against the secrets of his own ambition. He would learn that power, once lost, could not be regained through ceremony, but through the art of hidden alliances and carefully measured deceit. That story, the unseen chronicle of his reign, was about to begin. The first years of Charles II's reign were years of illusion, golden on the surface, hollow beneath. England seemed at peace. The streets of London bustled again with trade, laughter, and rumor. The theaters were open, the taverns were crowded. Foreign ambassadors remarked that the new court was livelier than any in Europe. Yet within the tall walls of Whitehall, the king understood a truth few dared to speak. The monarchy had returned in name only. He wore the crown, but not the power that once came with it. The Civil War had rewritten the contract between ruler and realm. Parliament now claimed authority not as a temporary body, but as the guardian of the nation's will. The sword that had once been raised against Charles I now hung, invisible, above his son's head. Every act of governance, every ship launched, every soldier paid, every ceremony financed, required the signature of the Commons. The monarch's prerogative had become performance. In council meetings, the king often sat silently, listening to clerks recite figures that sounded more like accusations than reports. The war debt loomed like a ghost. Tax revenues barely covered the salaries of officials. Naval officers demanded arrears. Garrisons waited for wages that would never come. The crown jewels, once symbols of abundance, were now collateral. Charles II, who could charm a room with a word, found himself reduced to supplicant in the chamber of his own government. The narrator's voice, measured steady, might have put it thus: no tax could be levied, no coin could be spent, without the hand of Parliament to release it. The king reigned, but Parliament ruled. At the heart of the crisis was money. A kingdom might forgive bloodshed, but it could not forgive bankruptcy. Charles II needed funds to rebuild the fleet that Cromwell had left in ruin, to maintain the dignity of the court, and to assure foreign powers that England remained a player on the European stage. Pride demanded it, survival required it, but every pound sterling had to pass through the scrutiny of the Commons. In the dim treasury chamber, the smell of wax and parchment clung to the air. Lord Arlington, the king's trusted secretary, unrolled a ledger across the table. The flicker of candlelight revealed the emptiness of the columns. Numbers crossed out, debts circled in red ink. "Your Majesty," he began cautiously, "the exchequer stands nearly bare." Charles leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the wood. He was not a man easily angered, but the quiet despair of that moment reached him. The monarchy that had once commanded armies now begged for subsidies. Outside, the rain tapped against the window panes, a soft percussion that filled the silence between them. Arlington hesitated before adding, "The Commons demand to see an account of the royal expenditures. They question the cost of entertainments, the pensions for your household, even the expenses of your ambassadors." The king smiled faintly, the kind of smile that concealed thought. "So," he said, "they will count every candle I burn, every meal I take, and in return they will call it a liberty." Arlington did not reply. He bowed, gathering the papers, and left the king alone in the half-dark room. The sound of the door closing seemed to echo longer than it should. Charles rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the river rolled black beneath the lamps. Somewhere out there lay the ships that bore England's flag, ships that could not sail for want of pay. His reflection hovered beside them like a ghost of his father's image. He whispered, almost to himself, "If they keep the purse, I must find the gold elsewhere." Religion, too, returned to haunt the Restoration like a specter that refused to be buried. The Civil War had not ended the quarrel of faiths. It had merely driven them underground. The Church of England had been restored, but its authority was fragile. The Anglican clergy sought to reassert dominance after years of Puritan rule, while the nonconformists, those who had, flourished under Cromwell, refused to surrender their pulpits. Catholics, meanwhile, remained the most distrusted of all, condemned by memory rather than crime. Three faiths, three loyalties, three fires smoldering under one crown. Charles himself was no zealot. Exile had taught him to value tolerance over dogma. He had seen the wars of religion consume Europe. He had dined with Jesuits and Calvinists alike. To him, faith was a matter of conscience, not statecraft. But England did not share his ease. In the coffeehouses and parish halls, sermons thundered against papists and heretics alike. Preachers warned that the devil wore a crown, that Rome plotted in the shadows. In 1662, seeking peace, Charles issued the Declaration of Indulgence, a royal attempt to grant freedom of worship to those outside the Church of England. It was a gesture of leniency, even humanity, but Parliament saw in it a challenge. To many members, tolerance looked like weakness. Liberty of conscience was a doorway to Catholic influence. They accused the king of overstepping his authority, of reviving the very absolutism that his father's death had extinguished. The debate raged for months. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Pulpits became platforms of politics. The Commons demanded withdrawal of the Declaration, and in the end, the king yielded. He needed their funding more than their approval. The words that might have united his people were quietly erased from law. And so, once more, religion became the language of power. As one historian would later write, in Restoration England, faith was politics by another name. Charles learned to navigate this landscape with the instinct of a survivor. He smiled at bishops and dined with dissenters, letting each believe what they wished to believe about him. He allowed Parliament its moral triumphs, its grand speeches on virtue and national security, while reserving for himself the one thing they could never control, his thoughts. Yet even patience has limits. Each compromise stripped away another layer of sovereignty. Each concession made the crown more ornamental, less essential. He could host banquets, commission plays, and pose for portraits, but when it came to shaping the future of the nation, he was a guest at his own table. It was in these years that Charles began to look outward, to France, to Spain, to the Dutch Republic, not merely for allies, but for leverage. Across the Channel, Louis XIV had transformed monarchy into theater, his every gesture gilded with authority. Versailles glittered with wealth drawn from a centralized state. France moved as the Sun King willed. England, by contrast, staggered under debate. The king studied Louis not with admiration alone, but with analysis. He saw what might be possible if a monarch could command his own resources, free from the constraints of Parliament. It was not envy that stirred in him, but ambition, the quiet, calculating ambition of a man who understood the currency of influence. He began to cultivate his diplomats more carefully, sending them to Paris and Madrid, not merely to negotiate, but to listen. He corresponded privately with foreign envoys, testing their loyalties, measuring their interests. Each letter was written in cautious ink, each phrase crafted to reveal less than it concealed. The crown, though besieged, was not yet defeated. In the council chamber, tensions simmered. Ministers argued over trade policies, naval funding, and alliances. Some urged rapprochement with the Dutch to strengthen commerce. Others called for alliance with France to balance the Protestant powers. Charles listened, outwardly indifferent, inwardly calculating how each faction might serve him. He understood that money was the key to independence, and foreign aid the only escape from Parliament's grip. France had it in abundance, and Louis XIV, ever the strategist, understood that England's poverty could become his opportunity. It was in quiet meetings with courtiers like Clifford and Arlington that the idea began to take form, a discreet arrangement beyond the reach of the Commons to secure funds from abroad. The king could maintain dignity, the navy could sail again, and no member of Parliament need know the source of the gold. It was, at first, a thought, a whisper in the smoke-filled rooms of Whitehall. But thoughts have a way of becoming necessity. Meanwhile, London itself became the mirror of its ruler, outwardly bright, inwardly divided. Coffee houses buzzed with arguments about liberty, trade, and religion. Pamphleteers mocked both the king and the commons, while merchants fretted over foreign competition. The economy creaked under the weight of debt, yet optimism clung stubbornly to the air. Restoration, England was a place of contradictions, prosperity and poverty, freedom and fear, laughter and suspicion. The king moved among his people with a grace that disarmed them. He could pause in the streets, speak to a sailor, share a jest with a merchant, and leave them feeling as though they had spoken to a friend. It was his greatest gift, the ability to be loved without being trusted, and trusted without being understood. But in the solitude of night, as rain traced lines down the windows of Whitehall, the charm faded, and the questions remained. What was a monarch who could not command? What was sovereignty if each act required consent? The very system that had restored him now held him captive. He walked the corridors of his palace in silence, the echo of his steps mingling with the drip of water outside. The candles burned low. The Thames rolled dark and steady beyond the walls. In that stillness, he paused by the window, the same window where years before his father had looked out upon the world for the last time. Charles watched the river flow and spoke softly into the darkness. "If they hold the purse, then I shall seek the gold elsewhere." It was not a threat, it was a decision. And from that decision would unfold the secret diplomacy that would define his reign. The alliances born in whispers, the treaties written in secrecy, and the delicate dance between conscience and necessity that would lead England into the shadows of power. For now, the city slept, unaware that its king was already plotting in silence. The Restoration had restored the crown, but not its freedom. The siege of sovereignty had begun. By the middle of the 17th century, the map of Europe had been redrawn not by artists but by armies. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had ended the 30 Years' War, but its ink had scarcely dried before the old order began to crumble. The Holy Roman Empire, once the vast skeleton of medieval Europe, was now little more than a patchwork of jealous princes. Spain, exhausted by endless wars and the loss of its silver fleets, was fading into twilight. The Dutch Republic, small in land but rich in trade, emerged as the new nerve center of commerce and credit. And, over it all, like the morning sun burning away the fog, rose France, Louis XIV had inherited not only a throne, but a vision, the idea that monarchy itself could become divine through discipline and display. The wars of religion had discredited faith as the foundation of unity. In its place stood the theater of power. Versailles was his stage, and Europe his audience. France's armies grew stronger, its diplomacy more precise, its language the tongue of courts and treaties. The balance that Westphalia had promised, a Europe of equals, was already tilting toward one power. The Habsburgs of Austria looked eastward toward the Ottoman frontier. Sweden guarded the Baltic, proud yet overextended. The German states, shattered by generations of conflict, sought only to survive. Venice declined, Poland divided itself by its own feudal freedoms, and Italy remained a chessboard of dukes and popes. Only France moved with purpose, its borders expanding like the tide, its ambitions dressed in gold and prayer. To the observer of history, it was an age poised between brilliance and fear. The fires of war had cooled, but beneath the ashes, ambition still glowed. For England, emerging from its own civil turmoil, this new Europe presented both opportunity and peril. Once a kingdom whose ships had circled the world and challenged the Spanish Main, England now found itself isolated and uncertain. Its colonies in America survived, but did not yet enrich the crown. The Navy, neglected since the days of Cromwell's Republican fleets, required repair and purpose. The treasury was empty, the army disbanded, and the nation's alliances uncertain. Charles II returned to a world that had moved on without him. France and Spain had resumed their rivalry. The Dutch dominated trade across the seas, and the smaller powers played their games of allegiance and survival. England, exhausted and poor, stood awkwardly between them. In the councils of Europe, diplomacy had become a dance of veiled promises. Gold, marriage, and faith intertwined like threads of the same rope. Every alliance promised protection but demanded loyalty. Every treaty offered peace but hid a price. For a monarch who longed for independence, such bargains felt like chains. As the narrator might have reflected, the English crown needed friends, but every friend came with a leash. In Paris, the court of Louis XIV glittered with confidence. Ministers like Colbert and Lyon built a system of wealth and war that seemed unstoppable. France's navy grew, its armies drilled with new precision, its ambassadors carried themselves like conquerors in silk. French became the language of diplomacy, French art the measure of taste. The king's motto, Nec pluribus impar, not unequal to many, was both warning and prophecy. Across the Pyrenees, Spain limped under the weight of its own empire. Its galleons still crossed the Atlantic, but the silver they carried served only to pay debts to foreign bankers. The once mighty tercios, the infantry legions that had ruled Europe for a century, now marched on half rations and fading glory. Madrid's palaces glittered with ceremony, but behind their walls the machinery of empire rusted in silence. In Amsterdam, the Dutch Republic lived another kind of dream. Its merchants ruled the seas with ledgers instead of swords. The East India Company stretched from Java to the Cape, and the Bank of Amsterdam set the value of currencies across Europe. Theirs was a new kind of power, mercantile, calculated, and confident. Their fleets guarded not empires of land, but networks of trade. Their ministers debated policy with a logic as sharp as the blades that had once defended their independence. To the north, Sweden still held the Baltic after its triumphs in the 30 Years' War, but its strength was fragile, its kings as ambitious as they were indebted. The smaller German states, Brandenburg, Saxony, Bavaria, dreamed of unity, but feared their neighbors more than their enemies. It was, in every sense, a Europe without balance, one empire fading, one republic thriving, one kingdom rising, and the rest watching, waiting. Into this shifting order stepped England, scarred, cautious, and searching for identity. Charles II could no longer rely on the myth of Elizabethan greatness or the glory of his father's divine right. The wars had taught Europe that kings were mortal and parliaments powerful. He had to navigate not only between nations, but between the factions within his own realm. England's diplomats found themselves in rooms where they once would have commanded attention, now speaking softly lest they reveal their weakness. French envoys spoke with the confidence of benefactors. Dutch merchants negotiated like equals. Spanish ambassadors still clung to old titles while their influence withered. The king listened to the reports his envoys sent back from the continent. Each carried the same message, dressed in different words. France was ascendant, and Louis XIV's ambitions reached across the Channel. The Dutch, though Protestant allies in faith, were rivals in trade and colonization. Spain, once England's great enemy, was now too weak to be either friend or threat. The continent was no longer divided by religion, but by economics and power. Charles understood that England's isolation was dangerous. A nation without allies could not defend its commerce or its crown. But an alliance meant dependence, and dependence meant compromise. The choice was cruelly simple: to bow to Parliament's purse or to seek strength in secret abroad. At Whitehall, the candlelight burned late into the night as the king studied reports of foreign movements. The names of battles, Dunes, Dunkirk, Breda, blurred into one long struggle for influence. England's victories under Cromwell had bought short-term glory, but long-term suspicion. European courts viewed the restored monarchy with curiosity and doubt. Was Charles a puppet of Parliament or a king in his own right? Could England be trusted, or would it drift again into revolution? The questions hung over every treaty table, every embassy corridor. And while ministers debated tariffs and religion, the real contest was one of perception. Whoever could appear stable would hold the upper hand. Louis XIV understood this perfectly. He courted England with compliments and offers, sending fine horses, gifts, and promises of friendship. Yet behind every smile lay the knowledge that gold was the surest persuasion. The Dutch, wary of French expansion, sought England's partnership through trade concessions and naval cooperation. Both sides knew that the loyalty of England could tip the balance of Europe. Charles II, ever observant, played the part of the neutral arbiter. He flattered each side, delayed commitments, and listened more than he spoke. His court became a stage for foreign envoys, each vying for his favor. Behind the banquets and entertainments, letters traveled in cipher, bearing words that could never be read aloud. England was no longer the lion of Europe. It was the fox, clever, cautious, waiting for its chance. Across the Channel, the continent braced itself for a new kind of war, one not of faith, but of ambition. Armies were modernizing, navies expanding, treasuries tightening. Trade routes became lifelines, colonies became pawns, and diplomacy became the new battlefield. Charles II stood at the center of it all, the reluctant player in a game whose stakes he understood better than most. He had seen what open defiance could cost a king. He had seen what poverty could do to a throne. England needed friends, but it needed them on its own terms. He knew that neutrality could not last forever. A storm was gathering on the continent, and when it broke, England would have to choose a side. For now, he would wait, watching the tides of power shift across Europe, his thoughts as guarded as his smile. The continent might be in turmoil, but within that chaos lay opportunity. And for a king who had learned to survive by secrecy, opportunity was the only true currency. In Versailles, the air shimmered with gold and authority. Louis XIV, the Sun King, moved through his palace as though the world itself revolved around his stride. Every corridor was polished to mirror his image. Every mirror reflected not just a man, but an idea, that the state and the monarch were one. L'État, c'est moi, he would one day say. And though the phrase may never have passed his lips exactly that way, it embodied the truth of his reign. He had inherited France when he was barely 5 years old and had watched the Fronde, a civil uprising of nobles, try to strangle his authority in infancy. He never forgot the terror of that rebellion, and when he came of age, he resolved that no subject, minister, or noble would ever again threaten the throne. His court became a masterpiece of discipline disguised as splendor. The nobles danced attendance upon him at Versailles, bowing to rituals that turned flattery into governance. Power under Louis was theater, dazzling, controlled, and absolute. From his study, he could command armies across Europe and fleets across oceans. Ministers like Colbert managed the treasury with precision, and Vauban fortified the frontiers with stone and iron. Even art and architecture became instruments of monarchy. Every painting, every opera, every ceremony existed to magnify the king's presence. France under Louis XIV was not just a nation, it was an idea that majesty could be manufactured through will. Across the channel, Charles II watched with both admiration and unease. He saw in Louis the reflection of what he himself could never be. One was the sun, radiant and self-sustaining. The other, a planet forced to orbit the moods of Parliament. Louis could raise taxes by decree. Charles had to beg for grants. Louis's army obeyed his gesture. Charles's navy waited for Parliament's approval. Where Versailles blazed with confidence, Whitehall whispered in caution. Yet Charles understood something Louis did not, that too much light blinds. The English king, constrained by circumstance, had learned to survive in shadow. He could not command obedience, but he could shape perception. He could not dictate loyalty, but he could purchase it quietly. And in this contrast between French glory and English restraint began the delicate art of diplomacy that would define his reign. Louis XIV saw England as both rival and prize. A Protestant island off the coast of Catholic Europe, it represented a potential ally or enemy in his long war against the Dutch and the Habsburgs. If he could win Charles's friendship, or at least his neutrality, France's expansion would face little obstacle, and so began the seduction of England. Ambassadors crossed the channel bearing lavish gifts, tapestries from Gobelin, wine from Burgundy, horses from royal stables. Letters flowed between Versailles and Whitehall, their words steeped in courtesy and calculation. Louis offered admiration, Charles offered ambiguity. To each flattering gesture, he replied with charm but no commitment. The Sun King, accustomed to bending men with splendor, found himself intrigued by this English monarch who smiled as he refused. Still, beneath the politeness, both rulers measured each other carefully. Louis saw in Charles a potential pawn. Charles saw in Louis a potential purse. For all his magnificence, the French king was pragmatic. He understood that gold could buy influence more efficiently than guns. And Charles, ever conscious of his empty treasury, began to wonder whether foreign wealth might succeed where Parliament's grudging subsidies failed. It was in this quiet convergence of need and opportunity that the first threads of secret diplomacy began to weave. Late one autumn evening, in the English embassy at Paris, a young secretary bent over a table scattered with wax seals, quills, and crumpled drafts. The fire had burned low, and the ink in his pot had thickened with neglect. He was copying a dispatch for the king's eyes only, a summary of his master's latest audience with the French foreign minister, the Marquis de Lyon. The words were coded, their meanings concealed in ciphers known only to a handful of men in Whitehall. Phrases like, "The weather in Versailles is improving," stood for military readiness. "Our neighbors to the east remain restless," referred to Dutch maneuvers on the Rhine. Each letter carried the weight of decisions that could change nations. A knock at the door startled him. The ambassador entered, cloak damp from the rain. Without speaking, he took the sheet, read it by candlelight, then held it briefly over the flame. The ink shimmered before curling into ash. "No copy," he said quietly. "The king prefers discretion to memory." The secretary nodded, gathering the fragments into a small brass tray. When the ambassador left, he poured a few drops of wax over the ashes and pressed them flat. By dawn, even the evidence of the message was gone. At Whitehall, across the sea, another man, perhaps Arlington himself, sat in a chamber where the air smelled faintly of ink and secrecy. On his desk lay a single sealed packet marked "Private for His Majesty." The wax bore the impression of the English lion intertwined with a fleur-de-lis, a symbol both hopeful and dangerous. He hesitated before breaking it. Inside were reports of French intentions, troop movements along Flanders, trade negotiations with the Dutch, and the tone, always the tone, of Louis's words. Charles read them carefully, alone, the candlelight drawing sharp lines across his face. He recognized flattery when he saw it. Louis wanted assurance that England would not aid his enemies. In return, he offered friendship, trade, and, though unspoken, money. To his ministers, Charles would say nothing. To Parliament, even less. The time was not yet ripe for open alignment, but he began to reply to certain letters himself, in his own hand, using phrases so artfully ambiguous that they could be read as both acceptance and refusal. This was the birth of the English king's shadow diplomacy, not sealed by treaties or trumpeted in proclamations, but carried on through hints, smiles, and the ink of private correspondence. Louis and Charles, the two cousins born of the same royal bloodline, now played their parallel games across the channel, one ruled by sunlight, dazzling and direct, the other by moonlight, reflective and discreet. Each saw in the other a mirror, one magnified by glory, the other clouded by constraint. Louis XIV's letters continued to arrive, heavy with praise and veiled promise. He invited Charles to visit Versailles, to witness a realm where kings need not plead. Charles replied with gratitude, but remained in London, where every move he made was watched by Parliament's eyes. He understood the invitation for what it was, not courtesy, but temptation. And so, night after night, he lingered at his desk, long after the palace had gone quiet. Quills scratched softly on parchment, the wax of seals cooled beneath his ring. Some letters were sent, others burned. Each decision left behind only smoke, faint and untraceable. Outside, the Thames reflected the flicker of lights from Whitehall, carrying them downstream toward the sea. Across that same sea, in Versailles, the mirrors of the Hall of Glasses caught the morning sun. Two kings, one bathed in gold, one cloaked in shadow, watched each other from afar, already bound by the invisible threads of power that would soon pull them both into history's quietest conspiracy. The winter of 1668 settled cold and gray over Europe, but inside the council chambers of The Hague, the air burned with the quiet heat of politics. England, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden, three powers once at odds, had gathered under a single purpose: to contain France. The war Louis XIV had waged against Spain in the Spanish Netherlands threatened to upset what little balance still remained after Westphalia. His armies had marched through Flanders with the rhythm of inevitability, and every court in Europe felt the tremor. The conference room was dim, its wooden walls breathing out the scent of old smoke and ink. Candles flickered in brass holders, casting long shadows over maps spread across the table. Representatives from each kingdom sat opposite one another. English, Dutch, and Swedish envoys, their faces pale in the candlelight, their voices cautious. The Dutch, led by Johan de Witt, spoke first, his tone measured, his eyes sharp. "If France takes Flanders," he said, "she will take the seas next. Amsterdam's trade, London's ports, Stockholm's timber, all will bend to Versailles." His words drifted upward with the smoke of his pipe, a warning and a prophecy. The English envoy, Sir William Temple, leaned forward. "Then we are agreed," he replied. "We sign not for conquest, but for balance." He hesitated before adding, "and for peace, the kind of peace that keeps kings where they belong." The Swedes nodded, pragmatic as ever, their minds on the subsidies that would come from England's treasury. Papers rustled, seals were pressed. Thus was born the Triple Alliance, an agreement that history would later call the first united stand against Louis XIV. Outside, snow fell on the streets of The Hague, muting the world into silence. Inside, pens scratched like soft blades across parchment. The diplomats exchanged toasts with restrained smiles, each thinking not of the alliance they had just forged, but of the advantages it might bring their own nations. For Europe, it was a pact of principle. For Charles II, it was something far more complicated. In London, news of the alliance spread quickly. Pamphlets praised the king's wisdom. Parliament congratulated itself for supporting a Protestant coalition against Catholic France. Bells rang, sermons thundered, and the people, weary of uncertainty, believed their monarch had chosen virtue over vanity. For the first time in years, Charles was hailed as the defender of liberty, the cautious shepherd of Europe's fragile peace. Yet behind the applause, he remained silent, thoughtful. He knew better than anyone that this new alliance was not the expression of conviction, but of convenience. To outward eyes, England had joined the Triple Alliance to protect the balance of power and curb French aggression. But to Charles, it was a gambit, a move in a larger, more secret game. His court advisors spoke of principle, yet his private letters spoke of calculation. In those letters, written in the king's own hand, sealed in wax bearing the lion and crown, Charles revealed a different vision. The alliance, he wrote, serves not merely to restrain France, but to remind her of our value. He knew that Louis XIV, proud and watchful, would see the alliance as a challenge, and that was precisely what he wanted. By presenting himself as an opponent, Charles could make himself indispensable, the man whose favor both sides would need to court. He would become the hinge of Europe's balance, the monarch whose neutrality could be purchased in gold. The narrator's voice might have said it thus: the Triple Alliance was not a chain of faith, but a net of advantage. It held its shape only so long as the hands that wove it found profit in its threads. In the quiet of Whitehall, the king walked the long gallery lined with portraits of his ancestors, Henrys and Edwards, kings who had ruled by will rather than persuasion. Their painted eyes followed him as he passed, and he felt their silent judgment. They had commanded armies. He commanded only appearances. But appearances could be powerful things. To the public, Charles appeared cautious, dignified, committed to Protestant unity. To France, he appeared unpredictable, a potential ally turned rival. To his ministers, he was inscrutable, smiling at debates but revealing nothing. In truth, he was waiting, watching how Louis would respond to the provocation. And respond Louis did. In Versailles, the Sun King received word of the alliance with a calm mask that barely concealed irritation. England, he said softly, seeks to measure itself against the sun. Let them learn what it means to stand in shadow. But even as he spoke, his ministers counseled restraint. They reminded him that Charles was a man who loved gold more than glory, a king who could be turned if approached in the right way. Thus began the second act of their unspoken chess match. The months that followed were a theater of diplomacy. Officially, England maintained its alliance with Holland and Sweden, its envoys exchanging polite letters and empty assurances. But behind the scenes, new couriers crossed the channel, carrying private correspondence in invisible ink. In them, Charles's tone was softer, almost apologetic. Our nations, though presently apart, share the same blood, the same understanding of majesty. The storms of politics need not dim the friendship of kings. To his ministers, he was the architect of Protestant unity. To himself, he was the broker of balance, the one man in Europe who could play all sides and emerge richer, freer, and more secure. For Charles, the Triple Alliance was never a fortress. It was a mask of virtue worn to conceal necessity. The moral language of Protestant defense gave him time to maneuver, to test loyalties, to measure the price of peace. In his private study, he would often gaze out of the window toward the dark curve of the Thames. The river carried ships bearing trade, wealth, and rumor. Beyond it lay the continent, restless, unpredictable, and ripe for manipulation. He thought of Louis seated in his palace of mirrors and smiled faintly. Their contest was no longer about territory or religion. It was about influence. Who could move unseen? Who could speak without speaking? And as he dipped his quill once more into ink and began a new letter to his envoy in Paris, his expression hardened. The alliance, he wrote, must be kept alive, long enough to be useful, but never long enough to bind us. He sealed the parchment, the wax cooling beneath his ring, and set it aside for the morning courier. Outside, the snow melted into rain, tapping gently against the windows of Whitehall. Europe believed England had chosen its side. Only Charles knew the truth, that the alliance was merely the first move in a much quieter, much deeper game. A game where virtue was currency, loyalty a disguise, and every promise, even the noble ones, was a piece on a board only he could see. The morning sun of Versailles spilled across marble and mirrors, flooding the Hall of Mirrors with its famous golden light. Courtiers moved like clockwork through the corridors, the air perfumed with power. At the far end of the gallery, Louis XIV stood by the tall windows, a letter in his hand. It was from his ambassador in London, a carefully worded report, ink still fresh, that spoke of England's alliance with Holland and Sweden. He read it slowly, the faintest smile touching his lips. Around him, ministers waited in silence, uncertain whether the news would ignite anger or amusement. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational. "So," he said, "England stands against me. They think they have found their conscience." He paused, turning the letter between his fingers, the parchment glowing in the morning light. "But England has never fought for conscience," he continued. only for coin. He looked up, eyes sharp as polished steel. If they can sign a treaty against me, then I can sign a treaty with their king. After all, his smile deepened. Every king has his price. The ministers exchanged glances, but none dared reply. The king turned toward the mirrors, studying his reflection. "We will not answer with cannons," he said quietly. "We will answer with gold." The camera, if one could imagine it, would linger on that reflection. A monarch, surrounded by light, draped in power so absolute that even his silence carried the weight of armies. Across the channel, the mood could not have been more different. In London, winter rain slanted through narrow streets, dripping from stone gargoyles and window ledges. The gray light of afternoon seemed to dim the city itself. In Whitehall, the candles burned early, fighting against the gloom that never quite lifted. There, Charles II received his own reports, dispatches from Paris, from The Hague, from Stockholm, and understood that the game he had started was about to change. France had noticed. Louis XIV would not let the insult stand. Yet Charles was not afraid. He knew that Louis preferred persuasion to war, and persuasion, when gilded in gold and flattery, was a language Charles understood perfectly. The two kings were now reflections of one another, one illuminated by the blinding gold of Versailles, the other shrouded in the half-light of London. Between them stretched a narrow sea, and across that sea, invisible threads began to tighten. Letters, messengers, whispers. It was no longer a question of nations, but of men. Louis did not waste time. Within weeks, he summoned his most trusted envoy, the Marquis de Ruvigny, a man known not only for his diplomacy, but for his understanding of sentiment. "You will go to England," the king said, "but not to the king. Not yet. There is another who can open that door." Ruvigny bowed. "Your Majesty speaks of Madame." Louis nodded. "Yes, Henrietta, the Duchess of Orleans. She is French by marriage, English by birth, and sister to the King of England. The blood between them will speak more loudly than any treaty." It was a simple plan and a brilliant one. Through Henrietta, beloved in both courts, Louis could reach the heart of her brother without the taint of politics. Family affection would become the courier of ambition. The following weeks saw letters carried quietly between Versailles and St. Cloud, between St. Cloud and London. Each was written in the flowing, intimate script of siblings, messages of affection, of longing, of shared childhood memories, and hidden among them, threads of persuasion. Henrietta's letters spoke gently of France's goodwill, of Louis's admiration for her brother's wisdom, of opportunities that might yet bring honor and peace. "France does not seek to command," she wrote in one, "only to understand. The king, my husband, and my brother could both prosper, if only they would see that their interests are not so far apart." Charles, reading these words by candlelight, felt the familiar warmth of nostalgia, the scent of youth, of exile, of safety. Henrietta had been one of the few constants in his scattered life, the sister who had shared his hardships when both were fugitives after their father's death. If anyone could bridge the gulf between him and France, it would be her. Yet even as affection stirred, calculation remained. He knew that Louis's hand was behind every phrase. Still, he did not mind. Influence was a game played by both sides, and he was no novice. In Versailles, Louis watched his plan unfold with the patience of a chess master. He understood that diplomacy, like music, required rhythm. A message too forceful would provoke resistance. A gesture too lavish might raise suspicion. But through Henrietta, everything could appear natural, unforced, as if destiny itself were smoothing the path toward reconciliation. At St. Cloud, Henrietta met with Ruvigny under the pretense of family correspondence. Their meetings took place in quiet gardens or in candlelit chambers scented with lilac and rain. Ruvigny, polite and deliberate, would unfold the latest proposals from the French court: financial support, naval cooperation, the promise of peace with Spain. Henrietta, ever graceful, would listen, nod, and then add a personal touch, a memory of childhood laughter in exile, a wish that her brother might know the security she had found in France. "Tell His Majesty," she said once, "that my brother is not unwise, only cautious. He will come to see that friendship with France is not submission, but survival." Ruvigny smiled. "And if he does not?" Henrietta's eyes softened. Then perhaps he will listen to his sister. In London, the first hints of this secret communication began to appear, faint, almost invisible. Couriers arrived at odd hours, bearing sealed envelopes addressed only to the king's hand. French envoys requested private audiences under the guise of courtesy visits. Ministers whispered of strange messages, but nothing could be proved. Charles said little. He simply stood at his window as the rain streaked the glass, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple on the Thames. He had started the game to secure power, and now the board was shifting beneath his feet. Far away, at Versailles, Louis did the same. Standing before his mirrors, his image multiplied into infinity. Between them stretched not just water, but will, and somewhere in between gold and gray, between candle and shadow, Henrietta of England became the bridge neither king could cross alone. Her letters, sealed with both affection and intrigue, carried the future in their folds. The seeds of a secret had been planted, and as the narrator's voice might have murmured over the closing image, from the tenderness of blood, conspiracy took root, and in that union of love and ambition, history quietly turned its page. The year was 1670, and England's splendor had begun to tarnish. The streets of London still bustled, the court still glittered, but beneath the music and laughter of Whitehall, the echo of emptiness grew louder. The treasury was nearly bare. Years of debt, naval repair, and political bargaining had drained what little gold remained. Parliament, once compliant in the joy of restoration, had turned cold and obstinate. Every session brought new demands, new accusations, new humiliations. Charles II had once mastered the art of patience, but even patience has limits. The House of Commons refused new taxes unless he yielded further power. Creditors murmured in every corridor. Soldiers waited months for their pay. And the court, once a place of wit and splendor, had begun to whisper. The king smiles, they said, but his coffers frown. He stood in his study one winter evening, staring at the fireplace where the flames burned low and uncertain. The shadows of portraits, his ancestors, his father, his exiled youth, flickered along the walls like memories that refused to fade. He had inherited the crown, but not the means to wear it. That was when Henrietta's letters arrived again. They came by courier, sealed with a ribbon of pale blue, carrying the scent of lavender from St. Cloud. Her handwriting was graceful, steady, touched with the warmth of blood and memory. "My dearest brother," one began, "France understands your burden. His Majesty, my brother-in-law, believes that friendship between our crowns could ease it. There are ways, quiet ways, to restore your freedom from Parliament's purse." Charles read those words by candlelight, his hand resting against his chin. He knew the meaning behind them. Louis XIV had extended his hand, and Henrietta was the bridge. To many, it would seem treason. To Charles, it looked like survival. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the Thames, the faint tolling of distant bells. He closed the letter and held it near the flame, watching the wax melt. Slightly, the thought came to him with both dread and relief. Perhaps the salvation of his crown lay not in London, but across the Channel. By the spring of that year, arrangements were in motion. Officially, it was said that Madame Henrietta, Duchess of Orléans, would visit England for family affection and diplomatic courtesy. The court rejoiced, Parliament approved, and even the people welcomed the gesture of goodwill. Few suspected that behind the silks and banquets, history itself was being written in secret ink. Henrietta arrived at Dover in May, her ship gliding into harbor under a pale evening sky. The sea air carried the scent of salt and rain, mingling with the faint perfume of her entourage. Waiting on the shore, wrapped in a dark cloak, stood her brother, the King of England. When they met, ceremony vanished. For a moment, Charles was not a monarch, and Henrietta not a duchess. They were simply brother and sister again, bound by shared memory and loss. The years of exile, the death of their father, the loneliness of two crowns. They needed no words to recall it all, but duty soon returned. As the night deepened, courtiers withdrew, leaving only a few trusted attendants. Inside the fortified residence overlooking the cliffs, a single room had been prepared, simple but guarded, its doors watched by silent men. On the table lay maps, drafts, and a single unmarked document. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters. The candles flickered, their light bending across the page. Henrietta sat beside her brother, her expression calm, yet resolute. "France offers help," she said softly. "Money to free you from Parliament's grip, ships to strengthen your navy, and peace between our nations. All that Louis asks," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "is understanding." Charles looked at her, then at the paper before him. The ink glistened faintly under the candlelight. He did not need to ask what understanding meant. It was the price of independence, an unspoken promise that, should the time come, England's king would show sympathy toward the faith of France. For a long time he said nothing. The wind howled against the glass, the sea beyond rising and falling like the pulse of destiny. Henrietta reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "Brother," she said, "you were born to rule, not to beg. Take back what is yours." He smiled faintly, that old half-smile that masked thought with charm. "And if I take it," he murmured, "will England still be mine?" Henrietta's eyes softened. "Only you can decide what England means." The hour grew late. Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs of Dover, scattering foam into the blackness. Inside, the two siblings leaned over the parchment, the flame casting restless shadows. The treaty, written by French hands but left unsigned, promised a secret alliance. Louis XIV would provide financial support, annual payments large enough to free the English crown from Parliament's purse. In return, Charles would maintain friendship with France, avoid aiding the Dutch, and, when the moment was right, reveal a sympathy for the Catholic faith that had once divided his kingdom. A dangerous bargain, yet to Charles it was not betrayal, but liberation. He picked up the quill. The feather trembled slightly between his fingers. Henrietta watched. Her breath held. The ink shone black as the sea beyond the window. For a brief second he hesitated. He thought of his father's trial, of Parliament's jeers, of the hollow sound of chains disguised as ceremony. Then he thought of the laughter at Versailles, the gold of Louis's halls, and the promise of freedom from the Commons' demands. His hand moved. The quill met the page. The signature began slowly, the ink spreading like veins across white parchment. Charles R. When it was done, he leaned back, the candlelight glinting in his eyes. Something between weariness and resolve crossed his face. The faint tremor of the quill had left a trace in his name, a small, human imperfection on an otherwise flawless pact. Henrietta exhaled softly. "It is done." Charles looked up at her. "No," he said quietly, "it has only begun." He pressed the seal of England into the wax, the red imprint gleaming in the light. The wind from the channel pushed through the shutters, extinguishing one of the candles. Shadows swallowed the room, leaving only the glow of a single flame, flickering on the treaty, on the ink still wet, and in the reflection of the king's eyes. Outside, the waves broke endlessly against the white cliffs, and in that narrow room above the sea, the fate of England turned, silently, invisibly, beneath the sound of the wind. The candlelight trembled against the damp stone walls of Dover Castle, as the wind howled from the channel below. It was late in the spring of 1670, and the night carried the smell of salt and rain. Inside the fortress, two figures sat at a narrow table. The King of England, Charles II, leaned forward with his hand resting on a blank parchment, his dark eyes fixed on the woman seated across from him. She was his sister, Henrietta, Duchess of Orléans, born a princess of England, but now a wife to the brother of the King of France. The years had aged them both in different ways. Henrietta's face still held its elegance, but her eyes bore the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen too much of court life. Charles looked more like a philosopher than a monarch, charming, intelligent, and weary. Between them lay the weight of two kingdoms. For months, letters had crossed the sea between them, letters written in ink and sealed with the fragrance of lavender. Henrietta had spoken of peace, of reconciliation, of a chance to restore her brother's freedom from Parliament's endless demands. She had not written openly of religion or of French gold. Some truths were better whispered than written, and now in this small room above the cliffs, those whispers had become real. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters. Inside, the fire burned low. A servant entered quietly with a small box of documents bound in red leather and placed it before the king. Henrietta glanced toward it and then back at her brother. "Louis offers more than friendship," she said softly. "He offers relief. From the commons, from their purse, from their noise. France can make you free again." Charles gave a faint smile, half amusement, half disbelief. "And at what price does France sell freedom these days?" Henrietta hesitated. "At the price of faith," she said finally. "He asks for understanding, a promise that, when the time is right, you will show favor to the true church." There was silence for a long while. The only sound was the sea beating against the cliffs. Charles' gaze dropped to the parchment before him. The candlelight danced across its empty surface like a living thing. He had always been a man of charm, of laughter, of delicate balance between pleasure and power. But tonight, there was no balance left, only decision. He rose from his chair and paced to the window. The night outside was thick with mist. Below, waves struck the rocks in slow rhythm. He remembered other nights like this. In exile, wandering from court to court across Europe, begging for support after his father's death. He remembered the cold, the hunger, the humiliation. He had sworn then that if he ever regained his throne, he would never be poor again. Henrietta's voice reached him from behind. "You cannot rule if they control your purse," she said. "You know that better than anyone." Charles turned back, the faintest smile playing on his lips. "And if I take this bargain, sister, what am I then? A king or a debtor to France?" "You will be a sovereign," she replied quietly, "and a free man." She opened the box and drew out a folded paper edged with gold. The handwriting was French, elegant, and precise. It bore the seal of Versailles, 3 fleurs-de-lis pressed deep into red wax. She unfolded it and slid it across the table. "Louis has signed his part," she said. "He offers the subsidy immediately, and his word of honor that France will stand with you, should England rebel." Charles lowered himself back into the chair. He read the document slowly, his lips moving without sound. The promises were written in the careful, conditional language of diplomacy: payments, fleets, mutual defense. But between the lines lay something larger, something perilous. France would buy England's friendship, and England, in time, would buy its peace with faith. He set the paper down and met his sister's gaze. "It seems a dangerous trade." "All trades are dangerous when kings make them," she said. He studied her face, the same eyes that had once wept beside him when their father was led to execution. In that look was a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had fought to regain. He took the quill from the inkwell, but his hand paused in midair. Outside, the storm intensified, battering the windows with wind and spray. The flames in the hearth bent low. For a moment, the room seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sea. Charles stared at the parchment, and in the reflection of the candle, he saw his own hesitation. "What if this destroys me?" he said quietly. Henrietta reached across the table and took his hand. "Then you will fall as a king, not as a beggar." He looked down at their joined hands, then at the waiting treaty. With a slow exhale, he pressed the quill to the page. The ink bled softly into the fibers of the paper, forming letters that carried the weight of a nation. Charles R. The moment passed in silence. Only the sound of the wind filled the room. When he lifted the pen, his signature gleamed wet and dark. He set the quill aside and leaned back, the faint tremor of his hand still visible. Henrietta exhaled, almost in relief. "It is done," she whispered. Charles gave a small shake of the head. "No, sister, it is only begun." He reached for the royal seal, melted a drop of red wax over the lower corner, and pressed the emblem of England into it, the lion and the crown, side by side with the lilies of France. When he lifted the seal, the mark shone crimson in the candlelight. The servant returned and took the document silently. Henrietta watched it disappear into the leather case, her face unreadable. Outside, thunder rolled over the channel. When they were alone again, Charles stood and went to the window. The wind had eased, but the sea was still restless, glimmering faintly beneath the pale moon. He spoke without turning. "When I was young," he said, "I thought kings ruled by their will alone, that crowns made men strong. He paused, the faint trace of bitterness in his voice. "Now I see we rule by debt, to gold, to counsel, to silence." Henrietta stepped closer. "Then let this be your silence. The world need not know." He gave a faint laugh. "Oh, they will know, one way or another. Secrets have tides of their own." For a long while they stood there, brother and sister, watching the horizon fade into mist. The candles burned lower. The scent of wax and sea salt filled the room. In that stillness, something passed between them. Affection, regret, and the unspoken understanding that history had already begun to turn its wheel. At last, Henrietta broke the silence. "Louis will be pleased," she said softly, "and so will you, when you see how easily Parliament bends once gold begins to flow." Charles turned, the faintest smile curving his mouth. "I have learned not to trust in ease." She studied him for a moment, then reached up to touch his cheek, a sister's gesture, tender and final. "Then trust, at least, in blood," she said. He nodded, though his eyes drifted back, toward the table, toward the empty inkwell and the faint gleam of his signature in the fading light. When she departed the next morning, the wind had calmed, and the sea lay gray and smooth beneath the cliffs. Charles watched from the window as her ship drifted away from the harbor, sails swelling in the breeze. A gull wheeled above, its cry sharp against the still air. He stayed there until the vessel was no more than a pale smudge on the horizon. Only then did he turn back to the room. The parchment was gone, locked away, and sent toward Versailles, but its shadow remained. In the quiet that followed, he sat at the same table and poured himself a glass of wine. The room smelled of smoke and wax, of night and decision. On the mantel, the single candle burned itself out, leaving only the faint wisp of smoke curling upward. Charles leaned back and closed his eyes. The war with the Dutch was already being planned, though few yet knew it. The funds from France would come soon, cloaked in the language of alliance. Parliament would rage, the people would question, and the king, bound by gold and secrecy, would play his part. He opened his eyes again and looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn crept across the sky. The sea was calm now, almost serene, its endless surface giving nothing away. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Louis XIV would be smiling, his ministers already at work turning ink into strategy. The King of France had bought more than an ally that night. He had bought the conscience of England. Charles rose slowly, his shadow long against the wall. "A king must sometimes play the sinner," he murmured to himself, "so long as he plays well." He extinguished the last candle and walked toward the door, the echo of his footsteps fading into the corridor. Outside, the gulls cried again, and the wind began to rise. The tide was turning. By the time the sun climbed above the cliffs of Dover, the ink on the treaty had long since dried. The world would remember the day as the start of an alliance. But for the man who signed it, it was something far more fragile. The moment when faith, ambition, and survival all met at the tip of a trembling quill. And though no one would see it, in that flicker of ink and candlelight, the fate of England had already begun to change. The year 1672 dawned gray and restless over the North Sea. England was again at war, though many in London could not yet explain why. Official proclamations spoke of honor, commerce, and insults from the Dutch. But the truth was buried beneath treaties signed in secret chambers. To the sailors who stood on the decks of the king's ships, none of that mattered. Orders had been given, cannons cleaned, and sails raised. The fleets of England and France now moved together, their flags rippling side by side in the sharp northern wind. The alliance that had been sealed with ink at Dover now revealed its true shape on the open sea. The English fleet, proud and practiced, had joined with the French squadrons under the command of the Comte d'Estrées. Hundreds of ships stretched across the horizon, their masts dark lines against the morning sky. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder. Beneath the decks, men worked in silence, adjusting ropes and loading powder into cannon mouths. Admiral Rupert stood at the stern of his flagship, the Royal Charles, watching the distant haze where the Dutch fleet was said to be gathering. The sea rolled in long, slow waves, the color of iron. Somewhere beyond the mist, the ships of the Dutch Republic waited, smaller, faster, disciplined. They had fought England before and survived, and their captains knew these waters better than any. When the order came, it was simple and cold. The drums beat once, twice, and the fleet turned eastward. Signal flags rose from masts, and the wind caught the sails. Slowly, the great line of ships began to move, creaking and groaning like a giant awakening. By midday, the two fleets had sighted each other. A thin mist clung to the waves, and through it came the flashes of light. Gunfire from the Dutch vanguard. A single cannonball struck the sea, throwing up a column of spray that hissed and fell back. The first reply came from the Royal Sovereign, and then from another ship, and another, until the whole horizon roared. The sea erupted. Smoke rolled low over the waves, torn by the wind. The smell of sulfur and salt filled the air. The thunder of cannon fire traveled across the water in heavy bursts, echoing between the clouds. Ships vanished into the fog, their sails glowing dimly in the flashes of flame. Through the haze, men shouted orders that were lost in the wind. From a distance, the battle looked like a storm, one made not by nature, but by men and ambition. The English and French fleets fought side by side, though not always in harmony. The French, cautious and calculating, held their distance, unwilling to bear the full weight of the fight. The English pressed forward, their lines scattered by current and smoke. For hours, the sea burned in bursts of light, each flash fading into the gray. As the day ended, neither side could claim victory. The Dutch fleet slipped back toward its harbors, battered but unbroken. The English ships drifted westward, their decks scarred, their sails torn. The wind carried the fading sound of drums across the water, and somewhere above the endless waves, the seagulls returned, circling in silence. News of the battle reached London before the week was out. Messengers brought word of a glorious beginning, of valor at sea. But the stories changed with every retelling. Some said the Dutch had fled in panic. Others whispered that the English had gained little but smoke and confusion. The truth was lost in the tide of rumor. The people of London listened, uneasy. In the taverns near the docks, sailors spoke quietly among themselves. The Dutch had been enemies once, but also trading. Partners, fellow Protestants, and rivals respected more than hated. The question rose again and again. Why had England turned against its old ally? A merchant in a coffee house on Fleet Street said it aloud one morning, his voice carrying over the noise. If this war is for honor, whose honor is it? And if it is for gold, whose gold pays for it? No one answered, but the silence was heavy. Pamphlets began to appear, printed anonymously, questioning the wisdom of the king's policy. We fight our friends, one read, while our enemies count our coin. Others accused the crown of bending to French influence. The words spread faster than the authorities could suppress them. In Parliament, tempers rose. Members demanded to see the terms of the alliance with France, to know what promises had been made in the king's name. But the ministers gave evasive answers. The Lord Treasurer spoke of the balance of power, the need to defend English commerce, the insolence of the Dutch Republicans. Yet every explanation sounded thinner than the one before. Outside Westminster, crowds gathered in the square. They shouted for news, for truth, for answers that never came. Some still cheered for the Navy, proud of its might. Others muttered that the war smelled of foreign gold. The sermons that Sunday were uneasy. In St. Paul's, a preacher spoke cautiously of unity and obedience. Across the river, another clergyman thundered that God's wrath would fall upon those who shed Christian blood for profit. The congregation shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Charles heard of these murmurs, but said little. He kept to his chambers, reading reports from the fleet and letters from France. The subsidies from Versailles had begun to arrive, quietly transferred through trusted agents. The gold filled his treasury, yet it brought him no peace. He attended council meetings with his ministers, their talk filled with numbers and maps. They spoke of controlling the trade routes, of securing victory before winter. Charles listened, nodding occasionally, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He remembered the night at Dover, the ink drying beneath his hand, the sound of the sea against the cliffs. Every dispatch from the front seemed to carry the echo of that same sea, dark and unrelenting. Outside, the city moved as it always had, coaches rolling through wet streets, merchants shouting prices, bells tolling from the steeples. Yet a sense of unease had settled over the people, like fog that refused to lift. The war that had begun with fanfare now seemed distant and uncertain. A letter from a Dutch prisoner circulated quietly through London that autumn. It was written in rough English and carried by a sympathetic sailor. "We fight not for kings," it read, "but for the sea, which belongs to none. You call us enemies, yet we are brothers upon the same wind." The words struck something deep in those who read them, though they dared not say so aloud. By winter, the streets whispered of failure. Prices rose, ships returned damaged, and Parliament grew restless. Ministers began to argue in secret, each fearing the storm they had helped to summon. And in the royal palace, the king's laughter grew rarer, his silences longer. The alliance that had once promised strength now bound England to a partner it did not trust, and a war it did not understand. The French gold still flowed, but with it came suspicion and discontent. The people had begun to ask questions that no treaty could answer, and above it all, the wind from the North Sea blew cold through the chimneys of London, carrying the distant echo of cannons, reminders that the war, like the tide, moved to its own rhythm, indifferent to the hands that had set it in motion. The war that had begun with ceremony and promise soon decayed into exhaustion. By 1674, England's banners hung heavy in the damp wind, their color dulled by rain and disillusion. The people no longer spoke of victory, they spoke of cost. Ships returned home battered and half-crewed, their sails torn, their decks silent. In the streets of London, merchants counted losses, ministers argued behind closed doors, and the laughter that once filled Whitehall grew thin. England was weary. France, though richer in gold, was no less strained. The great alliance that had been forged in secrecy now cracked under the weight of mistrust. In Parliament, the king's ministers faced accusations from all sides. How could a war begun with such grandeur end in such emptiness? None dared say that the answer lay not in the sea or the soldiers, but in the paper sealed with wax years earlier. The treaty born in shadows at Dover. It was a war built on illusion. The English people had believed they were defending trade, protecting the realm, preserving Protestant order. In truth, they had been moved like pieces on a board drawn by hands they could not see. The king had pursued one game, his parliament another, and the French king yet another still. Between them lay a gulf of ambition, bridged only by deception. The English navy fought bravely, but without purpose. Victories brought no security, defeats brought no lessons. Each battle left the same result: fatigue, confusion, debt. The Dutch, though battered, held firm. They opened their dikes and flooded their own lands to stop the invaders, turning water into a wall no fleet could conquer. The image struck Europe with awe. A people who would rather drown their fields than yield them. Against such will, England's ambition felt hollow. In Whitehall, Charles read the dispatches with an expression no one could interpret. He praised his admirals, rewarded his officers, smiled at the ambassadors who congratulated him on strategic perseverance. Yet behind that smile lay calculation, even relief. He had never wanted a long war, only leverage. Gold from France continued to arrive, steady and silent. And with every coin, the king's independence from Parliament deepened, even as his kingdom's spirit faded. In coffeehouses and markets, people spoke more openly now. "We were sold," said a shipwright on the docks. "The war was never ours." Pamphlets appeared, no longer asking questions, but offering conclusions. "The nation bleeds while the court feasts," one wrote. "France pays the king, and England pays the price." The presses ran all night. The pages passed hand to hand, whispered across tables and through alleys. But even those who spoke the loudest did not yet know the full truth, that England's war had been promised to France not out of alliance, but for a secret pledge of faith and gold. That the king who smiled in public had already bargained away his conscience in private. When Parliament pressed for transparency, Charles offered charm instead of answers. He dissolved sessions, delayed inquiries, and smiled his way through interrogations. His calm was his armor. "The crown serves the realm," he said, "as God wills." The phrase was elegant and meaningless. Outside the palace, protests swelled and faded like tides. Some cried for peace, others for reform, all for clarity. Yet clarity never came. The war dragged on until the treasury was empty, the morale broken, and the will to fight consumed. At last, in 1674, the inevitable arrived, the Treaty of Westminster. It was neither triumph nor disaster, but something worse, compromise. England withdrew from the war with little gained and much spent. The Dutch returned to their trade, proud and independent once more. France continued its continental campaigns, now without the need for English ships. And Charles, who had once dreamed of mastering Europe's game, found himself alone on the board, a player without pieces. Still, he said nothing. The secret alliance remained unspoken. To the world, he presented himself as the weary monarch who had sought peace for his people. In private, he watched as the French subsidies continued to arrive, disguised as gifts between kings. The deception held, barely. Historians would later call it the War of Shadows, a conflict without conviction, a struggle launched by paper and ended by fatigue. The cannon smoke had cleared, but the air remained heavy with doubt. England had learned that not all wars are fought for land or faith. Some are fought for silence. Charles often walked the halls of Whitehall alone now, his steps echoing softly through the marble corridors. He paused sometimes before the great map of Europe that hung in the council chamber, a vast tapestry of borders and ambitions. His eyes drifted toward the Channel, that narrow strip of water that had given him both his kingdom and his greatest secret. He thought of Dover, the wind, the ink, the trembling hand that had written his name beneath the fleur-de-lis. He thought of Henrietta, gone now, her voice still echoing in memory. You were born to rule, not to beg. And he wondered whether ruling by secrecy was any rule at all. The courtiers still called him the Merry Monarch, and he played the part well. He hosted feasts, told jokes, kept mistresses, and smiled through every scandal. But those who looked closely saw the weariness behind the eyes, the faint trace of doubt that lingered even in laughter. England had peace, but not pride. Its navy was tired, its coffers thin, its parliament restless. The king had avoided disaster, but not dishonor. He had gained security for his crown, yet at the cost of the nation's trust. When the final report of the war reached him, the list of ships lost, men gone, and debts unpaid, he folded the parchment quietly and said only, "So ends the storm." He looked out through the window toward the river, where the evening light shimmered faintly on the water. And yet the tide, he murmured, never truly rests. Years later, when courtiers spoke of the war, they remembered it as a distant blur, a conflict without heroes, a victory without meaning. But among the people, another memory remained, the sense that their country had been guided by hands unseen. It became the lesson of a generation, that when diplomacy turns to secrecy, the truth becomes its first casualty. And though the cannons had fallen silent, the echo of that truth lingered, soft as wind across the Thames, steady as the ticking of the clock in Whitehall, reminding those who listen that power built on deceit can rule for a time, but never forever. By the late 1670s, whispers had turned to shouts. London, once drunk on the laughter of the Merry Monarch, now buzzed with unease. The streets that had once celebrated his return now muttered of plots, papists, and secret oaths. The peace that Charles had purchased with French gold and silence had begun to crack under the weight of rumor. It began, as so many storms did in that age, with paper, pamphlets printed in back rooms, passed hand to hand through the markets, the taverns, the coffee houses. Some bore no author's name. Others carried the signatures of men bold enough to dare exposure. They accused the king of betraying the Protestant faith, of selling England to the Pope, of plotting the return of Catholic rule through the back door of diplomacy. At first, the accusations were whispered. Then they were shouted from every corner of the city. A broadsheet nailed to the door of a church in Fleet Street read, "The king serves two masters, one in Whitehall, one in Rome." Another, more vicious, showed a crude engraving of Charles kneeling before a French cardinal, a purse of gold in his hand. The government tried to suppress them, but it was too late. The ink spread faster than the law. At night, crowds gathered outside Westminster, torches flickering in the damp air. They shouted the names of ministers, called for inquiry, and chanted prayers for the safety of the realm. The faces in the crowd were pale and tense, a mixture of fear and fury. Some carried rough woodcuts showing a serpent coiled around the crown, the symbol of deception. Others carried copies of the so-called Popish Plot, a wild document that claimed Catholic priests were planning to assassinate the king and seize power for Rome. No one could prove the claims, but no one could silence them either. The rumor had become its own truth, and in the smoky air of London, fear was stronger than evidence. Within the walls of Parliament, the tension thickened. The Commons demanded to see the king's correspondence with France, the records of subsidies, the details of secret envoys. Ministers avoided the questions, promising transparency, but delivering nothing. One after another, accusations filled the chamber. Betrayal, corruption, treason. A few names were whispered more than others. Lord Arlington, long a confidant of the king, found his loyalty questioned. Clifford, once trusted, was now remembered as a Catholic sympathizer. Even those who had served faithfully began to fear the very shadows of their own reputations. When Charles entered Parliament, as ceremony required, he carried himself with his usual composure. His voice was calm, his humor intact. "Gentlemen," he said, "you fear ghosts where only politics walk." The remark drew laughter from some, but not from all. Beneath the smiles, suspicion had already taken root. Outside, the pamphleteers were relentless. Each week brought a new tale, letters intercepted, couriers bribed, confessions extracted. None could be verified, but all were believed. "The king keeps counsel with France," one claimed. "The queen hides priests in the palace cellars," said another. In the minds of Londoners, every shadow became a plot. For the first time since his restoration, Charles felt the ground shift beneath him. He had built his rule on charm and ambiguity, on the art of saying much while revealing nothing. Now that very silence had turned against him. His refusal to explain had once seemed regal. Now it seemed guilty. He confided in a few remaining allies, men like Danby, pragmatic and shrewd, who urged him to open his books, to show the truth, to trust Parliament. But the king shook his head. "Truth," he said, "is a coin no monarch spends twice." He knew that even confession could not save him. The truth was too dangerous, and the lie too convenient. In the evenings, he would stand at the windows of Whitehall, watching the torches flicker across the river. The chants reached him faintly. "No popery! No popery!" He remembered the same streets years before, filled with cheers for his return. The sound was different now, harsher, less forgiving. The rumors spread beyond London, into Oxford, into Bristol, into the countryside. Every priest in a black robe became a suspect, every French merchant a spy. Walls were scrawled with graffiti. England betrayed. Church sermons turned into accusations. Some called for Parliament to take control of foreign policy entirely. Others spoke of limiting the king's power. Charles knew what that meant. His father had faced the same winds, first as questions, then as demands, and finally as blades. He played for time, dissolving Parliament, then summoning it again, promising reforms that never came. Each session grew shorter, each speech more defensive. The members were not pacified. They had tasted the scent of conspiracy, and they would not stop until they had seen it exposed. Real or imagined, one winter night, an advisor entered his chamber with a stack of intercepted pamphlets. Charles took one, scanned it, and smiled thinly. "They call me a papist," he said, "and yet I have never heard Mass in my life." He tossed the paper into the fire and watched it curl to ash. "Faith," he murmured, "is a dangerous costume. Once worn, it cannot be removed." Still, the fire outside his walls grew brighter. The Popish Plot hysteria deepened. Parliament formed committees, hearings, and trials. Innocent men were questioned, some imprisoned, others ruined by suspicion alone. The nation had entered an age where fear governed more powerfully than law. Through it all, Charles moved carefully, smiling when he must, yielding when he had to, never revealing more than necessary. He survived by instinct, the instinct of a man who had lived through exile, revolution, and betrayal. But even survival came with a cost. His authority weakened, his alliances fractured. The very Parliament that once celebrated him now sought to cage him. Yet through every accusation, every printed lie, the king held to his silence. He had once told Henrietta that secrets were the only power left to a king. Now, watching the city's lights tremble beneath a smoky sky, he began to wonder if they were instead his curse. The bells of St. Margaret's struck midnight. Across the river, the crowd still roared. The torches flared and swayed, their reflections dancing on the Thames. And in the window of Whitehall, the king's silhouette stood motionless, a solitary figure surrounded by shadows of his own making, listening to a nation that no longer believed its monarch, but could not yet bear to see him fall. The winter of 1679 settled over London like a shroud. The fog clung to the river, thick and sour, and inside the Palace of Westminster, the air was no clearer. The Commons met under the flickering light of candles, the chamber filled with murmurs that rose and fell like the sea. Faces were drawn, tempers tight. The question that had haunted England for years now stood in the open. What exactly had the king promised to France? Charles sat at the end of the long hall, his eyes half-lidded, the expression unreadable. Before him, the benches of Parliament were crowded with men shouting for documents, for letters, for confessions. The speaker's hammer struck wood again and again, but order refused to return. The roar of voices grew, louder, echoing against the stone. They called for the heads of his ministers, Danby, Clifford, Arlington, each accused of treason, of deceit, of serving a foreign crown. Some demanded the king himself be questioned. The word impeachment hovered in the air sharp as frost. Charles listened without moving. The fire beside him hissed, the wood splitting in the heat. He had faced exile, rebellion, plague, and fire. But this, the quiet unraveling of his own authority, was the most suffocating of all. He raised a hand slightly, and the noise subsided, though the anger remained. His voice, when it came, was calm, weary, deliberate. "Gentlemen," he said, "the crown has nothing to hide but the dust of your suspicion." The chamber erupted again. Through it all, he sat motionless, his face a mask carved from fatigue and irony. He knew that explanations no longer mattered. The war was over, the subsidies were spent, but the shadow of secrecy still ruled the room. Once the people had loved him for his wit and charm. Now they read deceit into every smile. When the session ended, he rose and left without a word. Outside, the winter rain struck the windows in cold sheets. The corridor leading to his carriage was lined with guards, their torches flickering against the damp stone. As he passed, one of his secretaries whispered that another pamphlet had been printed, this one calling him the French king's ghost in English robes. Charles said nothing. He stepped into the carriage and drew the curtain closed. The wheels began to turn through the mud. The city passed by in silence, a maze of dim lamps, shuttered houses, and empty streets. Behind the curtains of Whitehall, the fires burned low. Across the channel at Versailles, Louis XIV dined beneath a canopy of gold. The room shimmered with light, music, and murmured admiration. The courtiers laughed, bowed, and drank. Yet the King of France seemed detached from their joy. His gaze drifted toward the window where the night sky stretched deep and endless. A messenger approached and handed him a sealed dispatch. Louis broke the seal lazily, glanced at the contents, and smiled faintly. "The English Parliament," he said, "still searches for what it cannot find." The courtiers waited for him to continue, but he only sipped his wine. After a moment, he said quietly, almost to himself, "A secret, once revealed, leaves only ashes." He rose, signaling the end of the meal, and walked through the hall of mirrors. His reflection followed him in infinite repetition. One king multiplied into eternity, each image a little dimmer than the last. Outside, the fountains murmured, the moonlight glinting on their spray. Versailles slept beneath the illusion of perfection, while across the sea, the world that had once bent to France's will began to crumble under its own deceit. In England, the crisis deepened. The exclusion debates began, an open struggle not only for power, but for the soul of the monarchy itself. The fear of a Catholic heir, of papal intrigue, of a future ruled by hidden hands consumed the realm. Every whisper became accusation, every policy a sign of conspiracy. The people no longer trusted Parliament, nor the king, nor even each other. Coffee houses buzzed with arguments that turned into fights. Preachers thundered of divine punishment. Merchants closed early for fear of riots. The kingdom that had once danced in celebration at its restoration now trembled beneath invisible fractures. Charles withdrew further into silence. He met with his council rarely, spoke little, and laughed less. He spent hours pacing the gallery that overlooked the Thames, watching the fog move over the water. It had the same color as the smoke that once rose from his burning capital, the same stillness that followed the roar of plague bells years before. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades, but now it seemed that rule was an illusion, a delicate theater kept alive by ceremony and memory. The people wanted a confession he could never give, and a purity he had never promised. He had played the game of secrecy too long. Now even truth would sound like deceit. One evening, as he stood before the great portrait of his father, he spoke softly into the empty room. "You died for your truth," he murmured. "I may yet fade for my lies." The candle beside him flickered, the wax running down like tears. The spring that followed brought no peace. Parliament demanded new oaths of loyalty. The king dissolved it once again. Each dissolution only widened the chasm between crown and country. The monarchy endured, but only as a fragile performance, a ritual without reverence. Foreign ambassadors wrote of a tired court, of ministers at odds, of a king who smiled but no longer persuaded. The laughter that once filled the salons of Whitehall had vanished, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than condemnation. In the minds of his subjects, the image of Charles II had changed. No longer the witty savior of the Restoration, he had become a ghost of compromise, a man trapped between faith and pragmatism, between loyalty and deceit. Historians would later write that his greatest enemy was not France, nor Parliament, nor the Church, but time itself, time that eroded trust faster than any scandal could. The illusion of monarchy had survived rebellion and exile, yet it could not survive disillusion. And so the story of Charles II became not one of conquest, but of corrosion. His secrets had once been his shield, but they had turned to rust. As the summer evening fell over London, the bells of St. Paul's tolled in the distance. The city glowed dimly through the mist, and the river carried its slow, patient current beneath the arches of the bridge. In his chamber, the king sat alone, a quill resting beside untouched parchment. For once he had no words left to write, no message to conceal, no game to play. Outside, the wind shifted, stirring the curtains. The candle flame bent, then steadied. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Whitehall, a voice, perhaps his own conscience, perhaps the echo of history, and seemed to whisper, "No throne stands firm if built upon deceit." Charles closed his eyes. The sound of the river filled the silence. The crown, heavy yet hollow, gleamed faintly in the half-light, not as a symbol of power, but of what power had cost him. And in that stillness, between the steady ticking of the clock and the sigh of the wind, England's most charming king sat surrounded not by courtiers or conspirators, but by the quiet ruin of trust, a kingdom that had once adored him, and now watched from afar as the age of illusion finally came undone. The last decade of Charles's reign unfolded like a long winter evening, drawn out, uncertain, and tinged with the chill of solitude. London, once reborn in the light of restoration, had grown weary again. The air still carried the memory of plague and fire, of endless rebuilding and quiet fear. Beneath its rebuilt skyline, trust had eroded like the mortar between stones. The laughter that once defined the merry monarch had faded into the echo of caution. The city was restless, and so was its king. He had outlived many of his enemies and outlasted the storms of rebellion and rumor, yet the cost had been invisibly steep. Each year seemed to strip something away. An ally, a belief, a piece of conviction. He held power still, but it was a brittle kind, one that relied more on inertia than on affection. Parliament remained defiant, the people skeptical, and the court divided by quiet factions whispering of succession, of religion, of what might come after the king was gone. Charles grew quieter, his wit, once his sharpest weapon, dulled into a kind of weary irony. The energy that had once filled Whitehall with charm now flickered like the last embers of a dying hearth. He appeared at council meetings less often, preferring the solitude of his private rooms, rooms that smelled faintly of ink, candle smoke, and damp stone. The kingdom around him had changed beyond recognition. Across the sea, Louis XIV still glittered like a sun at the height of his power, while in England, the monarchy existed under perpetual cloud. The same man who had returned to cheering crowds in 1660 now ruled over a nation that no longer trusted the throne. At night, Charles often walked the dim corridors of Whitehall alone. Servants would find him long after midnight, standing motionless beneath the portraits of his ancestors. His steps echoed through empty halls where once music had played and laughter had filled the air. There was one portrait before which he lingered longer than any other, that of his father, Charles III, painted in regal stillness, the eyes calm yet shadowed by destiny. He would stand before it for minutes, sometimes hours, his expression unreadable. Then quietly, almost as if confessing to a ghost, he would murmur, "You died for speaking your truth, Father. I have lived by concealing mine, and become its prisoner." It was not a lament for guilt, but for inevitability. The world had changed, and monarchy with it. The divine right of kings had turned to ash in the fires of civil war, replaced by bargains, signatures, and whispers. Charles had learned early that survival demanded not conviction, but subtlety. Yet in mastering the art of ambiguity, he had lost the power to inspire. The historian might say that Charles's tragedy was not his fall, but his endurance, that he lived long enough to see his own illusions dissolve. In those final years, his health began to fail, though few noticed at first. He moved more slowly, his laughter shorter, his evenings quieter. He spent long hours gazing at the Thames from the palace balcony. The river, always moving yet always the same, seemed to mock him, reflecting the moonlight in trembling fragments. It reminded him of truth, visible, shifting, impossible to grasp. Sometimes he would whisper to himself, "Power is only the art of delay," as if to justify the years he had spent maneuvering rather than ruling. But even he knew delay was not eternity. London, too, had grown cautious. Its citizens, scarred by decades of turmoil, craved certainty. But the monarchy could no longer give it. They looked to Parliament for stability, to commerce for prosperity, and to gossip for hope. The age of kingship as divine theater was fading. What remained was politics, raw, unglamorous, and cold. Charles felt it most keenly in the silence of his court. The musicians still played, but the songs were slower. Courtiers still flattered, but their words carried the weight of expectation rather than affection. He was still the king, yet no longer the center. History had begun to move without him. One evening, the moon hung low and pale over the Thames. The tide was high, the river glinting like liquid glass beneath the fog. Charles stood by the window, his reflection faint, the crown on a nearby table catching the same dim light. It was a strange sight, the man and the symbol side by side, both worn by time. He thought of Dover, of treaties written by candlelight, of gold that had bought silence, of laughter that had bought loyalty. He thought of the streets where his name had once been shouted with joy and was now spoken with caution. History, he knew, would remember him not as the tyrant his father had been called, nor as the hero he had once hoped to be, but as something in between. A king who survived by compromise, who ruled by secrets, and who left behind more questions than answers. The moonlight shifted, casting its pale shimmer across the water. It trembled with the current, breaking into fragments that glimmered, faded, and returned. To him, it looked like truth itself, always present, yet never whole. He turned from the window and sat down, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour. Time, relentless and impartial, continued its march. If power had once been his armor, it was now his burden. If secrecy had once been his refuge, it was now his prison. And as he sat beneath the waning moon, Charles felt the strange calm of a man who had nothing left to prove, only the faint ache of knowing that the game he had played so well had never truly been his to win. The Thames rolled on, silent and silver, beneath the city that had both crowned and condemned him. Its waters caught the reflection of the moon, blurred, uncertain, beautiful in its imperfection. And so, in the twilight of his reign, Charles II remained. Neither hero nor villain, but a man suspended between them, a monarch who had turned secrecy into art, and in doing so, found that truth, like moonlight on water, could never be held, only watched as it slipped quietly away. When the reign of Charles II finally drew to a close, England stood at the threshold of a new world. The age of divine kings had faded, replaced by something colder, more deliberate. the age of constitutional monarchy. Yet the legacy of the man who had once brought laughter back to a broken nation was neither joy nor stability, but something more elusive: secrecy. The Treaty of Dover, once hidden in locked drawers and whispered between monarchs, became the emblem of his reign, a document that bound two kings in faith and deceit alike. It was both visionary and ruinous. Visionary because it showed how diplomacy could move beyond armies and open declarations. Ruinous because it exposed how easily power could rot in the shadows. Historians would later call it the birth of modern diplomacy, the art of negotiation hidden from the people, where words were weapons and silence a form of strength. In France, Louis XIV had turned secrecy into theater. He controlled perception as carefully as armies. In England, Charles had done the same, but without the sunlight of authority to illuminate his actions. The contrast was stark. One king ruled as the sun, blazing and absolute. The other as the moon, reflective and uncertain, drawing his light from borrowed sources. Yet both men shared a truth. In the 17th century, secrecy was survival. To reveal too much was to invite ruin. And so Charles built his reign on whispers, alliances written in invisible ink, loyalties paid in coin and promise. For a time, it worked, but every secret carries a cost, and his would come due long after he was gone. When the truth of Dover finally emerged, it shocked the realm. The revelation that the king had promised to embrace Catholicism in exchange for French gold struck at the heart of England's Protestant identity. It confirmed every rumor, every suspicion that had haunted his later years. Parliament raged, the people recoiled, and the monarchy, already fragile, lost what little sanctity remained. From those cracks came the slow rise of accountability. Ministers would henceforth answer to Parliament, not only to the Crown. The government's acts would be debated in daylight, its policies questioned, its finances examined. The machinery of secrecy, once the engine of kingship, became the warning sign of tyranny. And so, without intending it, Charles II became the architect of his own undoing, and, in a strange irony, the unwitting midwife of a freer nation. When the Glorious Revolution arrived in 1688, dethroning his brother James and affirming the supremacy of law over monarch, it did not come as a storm, but as an awakening. The whispers of Dover had become the call for transparency. The shadow of secrecy had cast the shape of a new light. He had lived by discretion, but history demanded disclosure, and when the curtain was finally pulled back, England stepped forward, humbled, cautious, but wiser. Years later, in the halls of Whitehall, the echoes of that age lingered. The corridors once filled with Charles's laughter now heard only the tread of scholars and guards. In winter, snow would fall softly against the windows, muting the world beyond. Those who passed through spoke his name in tones neither loving nor hateful, but reflective, as if unsure what to make of him. They said he was a man who could charm a nation but never unite it. A ruler who wore the crown lightly, but the mask too well. He had built peace out of fear, stability out of performance, and in doing so, became both savior and captive of his own design. And so, as one chronicler wrote, he lived in the glow of a crown, but history remembers only the mask he wore. Outside, the Thames flowed as it always had, carrying the reflection of the palace, blurred, shifting, half submerged. The historian's voice, centuries later, would summarize what that river already knew. Secret diplomacy is not merely politics. It is the tragedy of an age where power walks hand in hand with solitude. Thus, the story of Charles II ends not with the thunder of downfall, but with the quiet sigh of understanding. His life was a study in contrasts, brilliance and deceit, wit and weariness, charm and calculation. And in that balance between light and shadow, England found its way, not through his perfection, but through his flaws. The king who had mastered secrecy left behind, at last, a single unguarded truth, that no mask, no matter how skillfully worn, can outlast the gaze of history.